CEO almost demanded a road trip, by user Davidre Photography. This one is from a few years ago. Said CEO has moved on to somewhere else, but we still joke about this in our team. Our previous CEO was leaving and a new one was hired. He was poached from a pretty well-known organization down in the city. A bigwig there, coming to be a bigwig here. He still lived down in the city, but rented a place closer to work and went home on weekends. Must be nice to be on two houses kind of money. Not long after he started, he went on a company trip. He didn't need his laptop, so he left it at home down in the city. During that time we had some kind of email outage. Not massive, but took us an hour or two to diagnose and fix. While the emails were down, we got a call from the CEO. He wanted to know what was going on, and we explained that there was an email outage that we were working to resolve. He got short with us and demanded we get it fixed so that his secretary could handle the emails, as if we weren't already trying, and as if his telling us to do so would cause it to be fixed faster because he asked us, and said that if we weren't able to get it resolved, someone would need to drive over 2 hours to his house in the city and retrieve his laptop so his secretary could access the cached emails there. We said we'd keep trying to fix the email server and soon enough, we did get it fixed. Made up crisis averted, I guess? Well, word got back to the rest of management, who pulled him aside and said that his behavior isn't the way we handle these sorts of issues. No apology from him, of course, but the dude got told to pull his head in. He's been gone for a few years now, but whenever we have an outage, we all joke that if you don't get this shit fixed, you'll need to drive 6 hours to collect my laptop, kiss my wife, and bring it back, the laptop, not the wife hates me, so I can stare blankly at it until this shit is fixed. Linear time is hard, by user NoFlyson4G. I was recently promoted to head of IT for a small law firm, meaning I'm a paralegal who is 10% better with computers than the attorneys I work with, so they think I'm a tech god. Don't worry, it came with a good raise in pay and lowering of required billed hours. We recently started offering mediations as a service and, it being 2025, we do many of these mediations, and the meetings to prep for them, over Zoom using fancy conference equipment. My office is right next to the conference rooms where the calls take place, so I can help out as quickly as possible if needed. As this is a new service that the firm really wants to work out, anything involved in this is top priority. At 9:55 a.m., the judge hosting a meeting comes running to my office saying the meeting isn't working. I run in after him and find the camera working fine, the little fancy conference tablet working perfectly, and the TV displaying with no issue. I ask him what the issue is, and he says there's no one in the meeting yet, it isn't working. I ask him when the meeting is scheduled for, and just as he finishes saying 10 a.m., the first guest joins the meeting. At 9:57. He thought the conference equipment wasn't working because his clients were 3 minutes early, not 5. I'm new to this. It gets easier, right? Step on it. No, harder, by user Trex_001. It's a week to Christmas, Friday afternoon, the weather is piss poor and I'm honestly already in a weekend headspace. When my coworker calls me, who's already on holiday mind you dear reader, and tells me I need to swap a generator we together installed. Well, I can explain to them how to do it on the phone. A literal trained monkey can do it. Just hang it into the brackets and plug 2 cable in, easy, right? Well, the doctor doesn't want to do it and neither do the nurses because they could break this expensive X-ray equipment. Oh, and they also don't want to pay for me driving out and doing it, which they want done today by the way. Now I'm not exactly thrilled to do this and I have to ask my boss if we're doing it for free, today. Sadly we do. So I sigh, grab the new guy and a screwdriver. A 2-hour drive filled with Eurobeat later we pull up just after closing hour at the vet with our singular screwdriver. The new generator is already sitting there, 5-minute adventure in and out. We take a test shot, that's an X-ray of a pen, marvelous, works like a charm. After we're done I get curious, is the old generator really broken? I've installed this thing myself just a few short months ago and it was brand spanking new as well as one of our better models. I've got a spare hand switch anyway and the new guy gets to irradiate a chair. Press, beep, click, and the display shows it exposed. A mystery for Monday, I want to go home, we're closing in on 6 p.m. anyway. So we call the nurses in, they marvel at Tiga's shitty X-ray of our pen and off we go, another 2 hours of Eurobeat await us. Now you may wonder, where does stepping get involved in this? First a bit of explaining of X-ray devices. There is hand switches and foot switches. When you go and get your x-ray taken, the doctor dresses you up nicely in lead to protect the stuff they don't want to see and evacuate the premise. These guys usually use hand switches because they've got their hands free. Now vets need to hold their patient down because a cat may not fully grasp the concept of radiation. Since they're preoccupied getting their hands scratched, they use foot switches. Think of them like a foot switch for a guitar or a gas pedal. Normally nowadays these have two stages, prep and expose. Same with hand switches. That is in case you want to control the specific timing the X-ray fires, so you spool the generator up in case you want to take an X-ray of a specific breathing cycle. Like say on a rabbit because they're notoriously bad at holding their breath in. That out of the way, I get back in on Monday at 11 a.m. and already my coworker grins at me and calls me a moron. Apparently the vet I drove to on Friday called and the generator doesn't work. That's impossible, both fired when I did and somehow none fire when they do it. So I call them up and watch the software side on their end from my cozy office chair. They first tell me they're suddenly using a foot switch, when I plugged a hand switch in on Friday. Okay, need to swap that, but they assure me they did. No dice. We go step by step and would you know it, it isn't plugged in. The hand switch is still in. We swap them out, and wouldn't you know it, now I suddenly see a response when they step on the pedal. It preps A&D. Abort. It's preparing to expose A&D. Abort. So I tell her to step on it. Indignantly the nurse responds that she is, in fact, stepping on it. Harder I tell her. By now my coworker is questioning if I'm having an inappropriate conversation on the phone. Again she tells me she is stepping on it as hard as she can. Now I know I'm dealing with a layer 8 issue and groan quietly after muting my microphone. The nurse is angry that this stupid machine isn't making the funny rays that make her see dog intestines, so, as nicely as I can, ask her to get another nurse. And, wouldn't you know it, dear reader, a different nurse slams her foot on the pedal like she's Max Verstappen and we immediately get an awful image of dog bowels. But I'm not here to teach them how to make a good X-ray. Nurse number 1 clears her throat awkwardly and thanks me. Now we could have ended it here and all laughed at a lady that couldn't step on a pedal, but Trex, I hear you asking. What of the original generator? Well, you guessed it, it's in perfect working order. They will not be getting a discount on their next order that return customers would usually be entitled to. The Problem-Solving Skills of a Blancmange, by user Pajarama. Working with a client with an on-site tech person and my colleague GH, and once again I am losing my mind to these two. The client has moved offices. We fitted out the new office ahead of schedule, putting in the best kit their budget would allow for from their list of approved vendors. 30 brand new Lenovo laptops, and Unify AC Pro 7 access points. I was off over the Christmas break and took the week before Christmas off. I have come back to find drama everywhere on this site. My company are arguing with our suppliers over the return of the 30 laptops as they are all blue screening. All sorts of heated conversations going back and forth about the hardware and swap outs and refunds. The client's IT guy has one use, and one use alone. His greatest contribution is to make sure that in the event of a localized hurricane in their office that at least one office chair is not blown away. Anything more than that, and you will see a glacially empty look in his eyes. GH is back on form, following the Puffin Big Book of late 90s troubleshooting. He had taken a laptop home with him and rebuilt it, and it suffered no crashes for 3 days. But within 5 minutes of it being back on client site, it's blue screening, he's stumped. His troubleshooting stops there. His default now is no longer investigate and resolve but buy stuff that by chance fixes the issue by default. Hence why the company is arguing for the return of the laptops. So we know it's something local to the client network. Let's do a bit of thinking. The Lenovo worked perfectly for 3 days at GH's house, and blue screened within 10 minutes of being on site. What's different? GH had it cabled in at home as it couldn't connect to his Wi-Fi. It's connected to the office Wi-Fi at the client's. Has anyone looked at the crash logs? What a stupid question, that would involve thinking. So I crashed on the lappy, oh look, RTLXXXX.sys is the reason for all the crashes, all of the crashes on all of the laptops. Realtek Wi-Fi driver falling over. A little bit of googling, lots of issues being reported for this Realtek chipset, posts all over the Unify forums for laptops with this chipset only blue screening on Unify AP7 Pro access points. Turns out the Lenovo bundled driver version 126 is the cause and is the latest one offered by the various Lenovo update apps, Vantage and System Update. Updating manually to version 162 from the Microsoft Update catalog fixes it. It took 20 minutes with a process of 1. Check crash logs, 2. Update offending driver detailed in crash logs. This is neither rocket surgery or brain science, yet neither of these two in the last 4 weeks have thought of this. Pagers still exist? Part 2, by user Dictionary 600. Part 1. About 2 days later, I got a call back to Hospital 400. They said that it had simply stopped reporting in with no warning, once again. Well, drat. I had put the original motherboard back in, but I left the replacement power supply in place. After all, I thought the original motherboard was bad at first, but I didn't know what caused it to go bad. Remember how I got stuck in the back room in my previous tale? Well, to Hospital 400's credit, they did resolve the how do I get out without the alarm sounding issue, in the just 2 days since I pointed out the flaws. They had a picture of the sensor posted on the door, and the sensor itself was now labeled Wave to Exit. Not to mention, they moved the shelf away from the wall so it wasn't blocking your view of the sensor. Thank you maintenance. So, I rolled in, armed with a replacement motherboard and a replacement power supply, as well as a module FO, and the laptop with the serial/USB cable in case I needed to reconfigure things. Little did I know what a show I was in for. This was pretty much the start of my workday. That's going to become relevant as the story goes on. I went to the rack, and this time, the screen lit up when I pressed the buttons. I entered the passcode that all the ones in our region were set to, and it said incorrect, which indicated that at least some of the configuration data was lost. That would indicate that the unit lost power and the internal memory backup battery was dead. Yes, the unit was that old that it needed a battery to hold up the settings between power outages. But somehow, it didn't lose the settings when I rebooted it 2 days ago. Go figure. After shutting everything down, I pulled the motherboard, then got my voltage meter out to confirm the battery was actually dead. Indeed it was. Unfortunately, so was the one on the replacement motherboard we had been carting around. Rats. Though the battery was still made and available, not enough modern things took it for any modern store to carry it locally. I didn't have anything on hand to jury-rig a temporary adapter to put AAAs or a coin cell battery in place as a temporary measure. Even if I did, so little information was available to us lowly technicians that I couldn't even tell if the battery we were replacing it with was even a rechargeable one or not. So I wouldn't be able to tell whether to use alkaline or NICDs, even if I had something to make an adapter out of. That's right, out of all our official suppliers, none of them would give us any specs on the battery whatsoever, not even whether it was rechargeable or not. Tech support time. I called them, and I forgot to try googling the part number on the battery itself. Service was spotty back here, so I went back out into the main room. What do you know, it wasn't a rechargeable battery. So, at least the jury-rig adapter option was still an option, albeit not the prettiest one. In fact, I wasn't entirely sure Company B would have approved of that unless the battery in question was actually discontinued, as opposed to simply being not available locally. But at least I knew what I was looking for. Configuring the system without the battery in place would have been a fool's errand, because once the battery did arrive, we would have to remove the motherboard to install the battery, which would definitely involve powering down the unit, and there was no way around it. There just wasn't enough space to maneuver the battery into place while it was installed. That, or we could just program it, and wait till the next power outage to change the battery and program it again, because the battery would have arrived by then. I called back to work to ask if they had any spare batteries. They did, but they were about 45 minutes away from Hospital 400, one way. Well, not the best option for anyone, but it was pretty much the only real one left. I called tech support simply to ask for a list of things to check while I'm waiting for the battery, just to keep busy instead of simply sitting around. He mentioned the antenna on the roof and the wiring leading up to it, as well as the wires behind the rack. That, and the self-diagnostic data one could pull from any working motherboard, even if it had lost its programming. Might as well get the roof work out of the way first, being that it was my least favorite part of the job. I wasn't that afraid of heights, but I wasn't that physically fit at the time, making ladders tougher to deal with. After getting the gate keys, I hauled myself up to the roof, tools and all. Nothing looked wrong with this antenna or the cables leading to it, but just for good measure, I cut the outer wrapping of tape that surrounded the connections. It was fine, so I rewrapped it. Wasted trip? Not necessarily. As a tech, it's always good to rule out anything you have time to do. In this case, We had already gotten a call back to the same location for issues that couldn't really be tied together in any way, all the more reason to do my due diligence to prevent yet another failure. After getting back down from the roof, I went back inside. With the motherboard back in place, I powered the system back on. It wouldn't transmit anything without being programmed, to prevent interference or other issues during programming or repairs. Remember how the password for the front panel was rejected? Well, I knew what the default was. Unfortunately, one of the keys on the keypad was worn out. That's one thing I didn't bring an extra for, of course. Thankfully, most functions were also available via the serial port. It did require a password of its own, but you simply typed that into the computer in question, not the keypad. It seemed a bit overkill to require a password on something that, in the original setup, would have required a key to open the rack in the first place. On the other hand, the password still worked long after all the locks on the racks had either fallen apart, or gotten stuck closed and had to be drilled out. And in all fairness, anyone can purchase a serial cable or a USB to serial adapter. I went through the rigmarole of basically pulling all the self-diagnostic data that was present prior to programming the motherboard. I put everything in a text document on my work laptop, even if I didn't think it was relevant. I figured it was better to have too much information than not enough, given that I wasn't printing it on paper, and we were only talking about 10 additional lines, not 10 pages or 100 megabytes of data. I know, 100 megabytes is small by today's standards, but that much text could fill a book. Just an example on where you would draw the line on what actually is too much. I got a phone call. The delivery guy from work was at the hospital, with the battery. I picked it up from him, and thanked him as well as apologizing for how ridiculous it must have felt to drive 45 minutes to deliver a battery. After putting the battery in, the next step was to program the thing. I had never done that before, so I called tech support. Their first suggestion was to connect my phone to the laptop and use it to remote in, so that he could go through the whole process. We tried that, but the back room didn't have very good cell phone service. It was good enough for text messages and voice calls, but not enough for actual internet. Hospital Wi-Fi? No can do. It was against their security procedure to have devices not provided by the hospital connected to their network. That also applied to their wired network, so even if there was an Ethernet jack back there and an inlet or adapter for the laptop, we would have still been sole anyway. Because hospitals deal with sensitive patient data, that did at least make sense. Plan C was for me to go out into the main room and have him remote into the laptop, and put all the commands I would need to type, into a text document. Then I could do it manually, but still have all the data in front of me, and be able to proofread the commands and codes I was typing in before I hit enter on each line. Tedious, I know, but someone's gotta do it. About an hour and a half later, it's already past what would have normally been my lunch time, but since I was done typing in all the commands and such, I opted to test the system by calling the test pager I had brought with me, just for that purpose. I called the pager with my phone. Everything sounded right over the phone, but the pager never beeped. It was definitely on, but it simply didn't respond. I waited a few minutes and still, nothing happened. I called it again, same deal. So I called, Company B's, tech support again. I asked him where I should look to see if the motherboard received anything. He said there wasn't a way to check for that, and then I asked if he could see from his end how far the packet got before it stopped. He said that the system didn't have a way of showing that, and in fact, there was no feedback at all that showed how far a call got before it failed, not from either end of the chain. The system communicated with the main hubs via landline, but you could unplug the landline, and then call the pager, and none of the main hubs would report any error condition, because it was literally one-way communication. You read that right, the same system that periodically reported in whether it was okay or not, also had no feedback to confirm that a message actually got to the pager, or even just to the transmitter unit in the hospital or whatever. Not only that, there was no message to the central hubs when a transmitter unit was rebooted. The tech support asked me if the hospital had a landline phone I could borrow. I asked around for one, but all they had by that time were Ethernet-based digital phones, no more analog landline phones. Well, I knew the voltage that a landline was supposed to be, 48V, give or take. Quick work for my multimeter. Spot on. I asked tech support for the pinout of the power supplies, in case a voltage was off, but not far enough to trigger the red error light on the front. Unfortunately, I was told that the pinout of the power supplies wasn't provided by the manufacturer, even to the top-tier tech support guys like himself. This basically meant I had no way to test the power supplies other than swapping them around. I told tech support that I hadn't tried replacing Module F yet. He gave me the go-ahead to do so. I hung up, needing both hands to do that job and not really seeing a point in keeping him on the phone just to listen to a module being removed. This module wasn't quite as easy to replace, since it had a coaxial wire behind one of the covers that had to be unscrewed. I got that done, and booted up the rack again. I made the obligatory test call, only to be met with failure once again. Because I didn't know of a way to pull the configuration data from the motherboard and check it for typos on my part, I decided to just redo everything, but meticulously check what I typed before hitting enter this time, which meant it took longer. Still no dice. Between replacing the Module F and then redoing the configuration to the motherboard, I had wasted another hour, just to end up back at square one. I was hungry, so I wrote on my makeshift on-the-go time card that I was going out to get myself some lunch. While I was on the way, Company B called to ask if the site was back up yet. I explained that I had replaced Module F and then tried to redo the configuration on the motherboard, in case I had made a mistake, and the pages still weren't going through. He mentioned that the upper management guys at my company had already approved Saturday overtime if it was needed to get the system back up. I told him I was on my way to lunch, and that I had put it off for a fairly long time to get it back up. Thankfully, he didn't argue with that. Internally dreading the idea of losing my weekend to this old pile of scrap metal, I cut my lunch to 30 minutes instead of the usual hour, in hopes of either avoiding that, or making that much more progress. After my abridged lunch break, I returned to the hospital. For a lack of anything better to try, I swapped power supplies between the one that powered the amplifier with the one that powered the everything else. No dice. Out of options, I replaced the motherboard. After moving the battery over to the new board, I hooked up my laptop and redid all the configuration once again. After all that, I went through the error logs and nothing showed up, which was a good sign. I made the obligatory test call to the pager and nothing happened. But no errors showed up either. I called back tech support, and they asked me if I had another motherboard on hand to try. I told him no. He said he would call someone else from Company B to bring me 2 amplifiers and 2 motherboards. This time, I was stuck with nothing to do, not even busy work that would look like anything or have a tangible effect on anyone or anything, or even to make my own job easier when the parts came. When the new parts came, tech support said I should replace both the amplifier and the motherboard, and not put either of the originals back. Even if it didn't work the first time, I should swap both to the second pair, rather than one at a time, in case one somehow was damaging the other. The first motherboard didn't even boot in the first place, so I replaced both it and the amplifier with the second pair, and put the battery on the replacement board. I redid all the configuration BS once again, and then made the test call. The pager finally beeped. Hallelujah! I called back Company B tech support and let them know that the second pair that was brought to me was the one that worked. So I marked all the removed modules as bad and packed everything up. By this time, I was going to be late returning to base, but that just meant overtime pay, including the half-hour of lunch that I lost. All in all, I was quite proud of myself for keeping my composure while talking to people, and still maintaining enough external patience not to screw something up or just give up on the ticket. When I returned to work the following Monday, the boss told me that someone from Company B had to go back to Hospital 400 on Saturday, because the paging rack had essentially gone up in smoke. He told me that every module they removed smelled like smoke, and the motherboard was visibly burned and obviously beyond repair. The modules were sent back to see if there was any hope at all. In the meantime, they were pretty much having to rebuild the system from scratch, other than the backplane and wires. I was honestly expecting to be fired, pun intended, by the end of the week, thinking I had somehow destroyed the rack. A few days later, I was told that every one of the modules they pulled out on Saturday, turned out to be damaged beyond repair. The cause was never fully determined, but the running theory was that the second power supply, the one that powers everything but the amplifier, somehow short-circuited, causing the voltage to skyrocket and burn up everything connected. However, that didn't explain why the amplifier and its separate power supply burned up, as well. The only connection to the motherboard was the data and signal lines. They didn't share any power supply related connections. If there had been a wiring fault in the hospital or lightning hit the building or power line directly, multiple things in the hospital would have been fried. Not to mention, the paging system was on one of the important branches which was not only on the backup generator, but also had a lot more protection against surges and noise than things like TVs and lights. In short, I was determined not to be at fault and my job was safe. I later left that job, not because of that system, but rather because I often went without actual tickets to resolve for such a long time, that I would even run out of busy work to help co-workers with anything. Therefore, I was genuinely concerned they'd realize I was redundant/not needed and lay me off. The company sort of had a love/hate relationship with the paging system, because it was the only thing that needed maintenance often enough to keep us moving, but it had deteriorated to the point that meeting the target uptime goals, along with the speed of service restoration, was effectively impossible. The biggest problem was the inability to troubleshoot the individual modules. We didn't have a way to bench test them, and not enough specs to do that many measurements. If we had known working modules we could rule one out that way, but there were no longer new ones available, so we could only rely on modules that had come back from the repair shops that still worked on these things, including the OEM. Unfortunately, the repaired modules were so unreliable, that replacing a part didn't rule it out, even if you replaced it more than once. TLDR, 2 days after fixing a paging system once, I had to go back to fix it again. I had to delay my lunch and work overtime to restore the old pile of scrap metal to health. Then it went up in smoke the next day.